Hey everyone, this is Will from Charlotte, North Carolina, and welcome to this brand new and exciting episode of The Missing Piece. Just over a month, the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine right now does not look like it's going to end very soon. As a matter of fact, recently, the Chinese government sent their delegates, the foreign minister, on a trip. The purpose of the journey is not only to consolidate the power center on this region or on this country, but most importantly, to sending a clear message from the Chinese perspective how they are going to react to this war. But meanwhile, this ongoing conflict has completely changed the international community. How about the refugee crisis? And how about using the digital platforms, continue asking for support and asking for resources for the country of Ukraine? But at the end of the day, the question that we should ask is, how should we make up everything going on inside the war and the outside noises from the international communities? So that's why it's my great honor to invite Dr. Idris. Dr. Idris is a lecturer in digital journalism at the University of Stirling. He's a senior editor at Newlines Magazine, a contributing editor at the Los Angeles Review of Books. He's also a columnist at the New Arab and the former research fellow at the University of Denver Center for Middle East Studies. And of course, that he's also lectured in politics, philosophy, international relations, and he's also the author of the book entitled The Road to Iraq, The Making of a Neoconservative War. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Dr. Idris. Idris, welcome to The Missing Piece.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Sir, let's get started. Again, as I mentioned in the intro, it's so interesting, how I connect with you through that one of the amazing articles that you wrote. And specifically, you touch on something so relevant to all of us today is the word identity. We tend to say that each country today under this globalization and tend to use different ways to identify who we are or who they are. Now, today, in the midst of the whole ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, I think the word identity has become more ambiguous or even unclear. So from your perspective, sir, how do you think that we should define the word identities today under today's globalization?
Well, there's a whole field of people who discuss identity and who are trying to pin down definitions, and so I wouldn't even want to go there. I will try to address it from the perspective of people's experience of identity. So, as I was mentioning in this article, that currently, for example, so we saw that there was in the coverage of the Ukraine crisis. Many Western media organizations identified with the victims, gave very sympathetic coverage, and described them as Europeans who were suffering something which was unusual in Europe. And that was that's great. I mean, that kind of empathy is being provided to all these individuals who are clearly in distress. But I was pointing out that should this crisis continue for a long time, so we shouldn't take it for granted that these identifications will remain constant, because these same people of Eastern Europe, for example, were treated very differently in the UK just about a decade back. So Poles, there was very open hostility towards Poles. They were always on the front pages of the tabloid news, being demonized. And Poles are just as blonde and blue-eyed as Ukrainians. So Eastern Europeans generally were, and then Bulgaria when it joined the EU. So again, there was a whole lot of fear-mongering in the media over here. So there was no such identification. There was no notion that, well, they are like us, they're Christians, they're Europeans, and that's That's why we should embrace them. So these things can be circumstantial, that these things can very much relate to the context, and the identification does not necessarily last. My warning was that we should not take it for granted that these kinds of identifications will be maintained. And over time, for Ukraine, the ideal situation would be that this crisis is resolved as quickly as possible, because if it depends in some way on these identifications, then they will be already there are concerns. For example, UK has announced many supposedly sympathetic policies towards Ukraine, and at least in the military realm, it has helped quite a bit. Probably it was ahead of the game, and it provided a lot of the resources. But in terms of accepting refugees, it has dragged its feet more than anybody else. It has created more complications for Europe, for any Ukrainian who wants to come and visit. So those are the things that are important to consider, that there are those identifications are not clear cut. They are not constant. They are changeable. And so because of that identity itself, that's why my kind of based on my experience and what I've viewed, identity is not something that is, something inherent, that it is constructed, and over time it can change. And based on that, policies, if there are policies based on identity and identification, that can also change over time.
Well, Idris, that it's so interesting that we always talk about, or we always use the word policies or political aspects, that when we link the word identities together today. I mean, given this condition, you're right, because politics, it's a very complicated game. And of course, that especially under this ongoing war and conflict in any countries, it's rather difficult and challenging for us to continue to be identifiable, at this moment. But let me share something with you this morning, just based on the latest report. Current leader of Ukraine, Zelensky. Again, the article came out to say Zelensky right now is having doubts and the second thought regarding if Ukraine should join the NATO. So that's number one. And number two, even the Zelensky is pondering maybe Ukraine should share or give, probably give the better word, a part of this country to Russia. So in other words, he's trying to make concessions and he's trying to make compromise with Vladimir Putin. But it's so ironic, at the beginning, he was the one who's calling the international community to stand together, to stand behind the Ukrainian people. But right now, he is thinking, or he's pondering upon the idea their compromise or concession should actually end the war very soon. So again, Idris, from your perspective, what changed Zelensky's mind, and why do you think that he's even thinking or planning such strategies? Is it because people, war, costs, or any other reasons?
Well, I think without actually knowing exactly his motivations, well, what I can speculate is that there may be two reasons for that. One is that Russia plays that game of negotiations and kind of peace talks, while in the meanwhile, what it does is that it consolidates its position. In Syria, what it did was it constantly negotiated and created these local ceasefires. And the consequences of that was that if it was creating a local ceasefire in the south, that would free up its forces to wage a fuller scale war in Aleppo. And if it was waging a fuller scale war in Aleppo, so then it will free up its forces that's one of the reasons why Palmyra, the historical site, fell twice, because at that time it was left undefended, because Russia and the regime, they had withdrawn their troops and they had deployed them to Aleppo because that was more of a strategic importance for them. So that game Russia has successfully played. So this could be Zelensky's way of trying to diffuse or neutralize Russia's approach, because Russia always relies on the fact that obviously no country would want to willingly give up its territory or any of its interests if it's being forced to. So they are going to take a much more clear cut or much more kind of a, you would say that unshakable position. And that can make that party look like that they are the obstacle to peace. And so in this way, Zelensky, by saying that, well, they're willing to accept some of these demands. So he's making it appear like he's not the intransigent, or he's not the hesitant party over here, that Russia is the aggressor. So that is being once again confirmed through this. And the second thing is also that sometimes, regardless of how we like to see it, the fact of the matter is that most of the time in history, power or just sheer brutality has won. And, I'm sure that Zelensky certainly wouldn't want to give up on a city like Mariupol, which is, is so integral to Ukraine. But the thing is that even now he was calling on, even today they have negotiated this possibility of a humanitarian corridor. And he had even asked the soldiers that they don't have to resist all the way to death, because, there would be more opportunities to try to resolve this crisis. But the thing is that the war continues and the resistance continues. And it is just something that, and the third thing also is that it's worth remembering that Zelensky could say this, but he heads a democratic country, that he cannot make a decision on his own. So he will ultimately have to put it to a referendum, or he will have to get some kind of a consent from the public. So his saying that shows that Ukraine is not the obstacle over here, that Ukraine is willing to negotiate a peace. But the thing is that at the same time, Zelensky is not the all-powerful authority. He's not Vladimir Putin, that he's not the only decider. So because of that, I think that it creates it certainly gives Ukraine disadvantages. Secondly, the thing about NATO, that has, from the beginning, it has been a kind of a red herring. Obviously, Putin has used it, but even you saw that in his speech just before he launched the invasion, that there was no mention of that it was all about Ukraine is like an integral part of Russia, and the Ukrainian and Russians are the same people, and that's why somehow Russia has claims over them. And so he was thinking of Ukraine as an artificial country. It's not a real country, and that's why we have a right to reclaim these Russian lands. That's what he was speaking about. He wasn't talking about, in fact, one of the things that you will see is that the countries which did join join NATO, so the Baltic countries, for example, they are not the ones that are being invaded. Ukraine was invaded because it's not a member of NATO and it has no treaty protections. So in some senses, in fact, the irony was that while there was great enthusiasm in Ukraine for joining the EU, there wasn't similar enthusiasm for joining NATO. Now they will have to reconsider that, because do they want to remain as vulnerable as they have been right now? That NATO countries may be sending them weapons, but nobody's going to come to their defense. Even when they're drawing red lines, they're talking about as they did in Syria, that chemical weapons is a red line. But even if there is a chemical attack, do we really expect the US is going to intervene? I don't think so. So that's very unlikely that any NATO country is going to intervene.
Sir, I think you're right, especially on the point, because over the weeks that I spoke with, and I also invite other distinguished guests to share regarding the role of U.S. play, in the midst of the whole ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. But we're going to get to that in a second. Let's talk about something more critical at this moment. Is regarding the topic on refugee crisis. For centuries that we have been witnessing, where we have seen that how refugees has become the center of the political topics. The countries on the European side and opened up doors and to welcome the refugees from all those war-torn nations. But right now, in the midst of the whole conflict or the ongoing war, Poland, it was the first nation opened up the border to the refugees from Ukraine. And other countries and from the European side are also hesitating or perhaps about to open the doors to from the perspective of humanitarian projects. But one thing I want to know is, it's so interesting that on one side, we would love to see the refugees are well taken care of because we know that these are the innocent lives, especially for children and for women. But on the other hand, some of the countries are stuck in the middle because they have no idea or they're clueless regarding what to do with the refugees after their arrival. So in other words, what could we legalize them, or what kind of stability should we provide for them? So, sir, from your perspective, and number one, at this moment, how is this refugee crisis different from the previous one we're talking about? And the second one is, for some of the countries, would you say at this moment it's better to stay away from this topic, or we should definitely engage more in terms of refugee crisis and humanitarian projects?
I think that one of the motivations for why I wrote that article was there was this very kind of divided debate happening around this. There was a lot of divisions over the refugee issues. On one hand, obviously, everybody was welcoming the fact that, well, refugees are, for once, they are being well treated. So which is really a welcome development that refugees are being received so generously. But there was, on the other hand, there was a kind of almost resentful response which was a lot of people were saying that, well, why weren't refugees from this place or that place treated with similar generosity? And which is true, that refugees in the past have not been well treated in Europe, and there's tons of evidence of that. So the question arises, why the different treatment? So the primary reason that most people went to is that it has to be racism, or it has to be, the fact that other people who are coming from the rest of the world didn't get the sympathy because they were seen as being different. There's certainly something, part of that is the answer, but that is not the entire answer. In fact, I don't think that is even the significant answer. The significant fact is that it's a more intense and more quickly developed crisis than anywhere else. I've been following Syria very closely for a long time, and it wasn't until 2 years into the Syrian war that we had the first big wave of refugees that happened, and even that was not on this scale. Even though eventually, more than half of Syria's population will get displaced, but it happened more gradually, and there were these spikes of flight of people, but it was never at that scale. But when it did happen finally, again, I won't dismiss that while European Union has behaved most of the time pretty abysmally, but there were also moments of real generosity, like Germany, that the way it allowed so many, or it invited so many refugees to come in and gave them asylum. So that is something to really appreciate. Sweden did the same thing. Canada did the same thing. And I think that those are, I wouldn't dismiss that the kind of generosity shown there, especially because in the region, apart from Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan and Iraq, most of the countries, very rich countries, they haven't shown any similar generosity. They can very easily take a whole lot of Syrian refugees. They didn't. So because of that, I wanted to keep those things in perspective. That you have to keep those things in perspective. One is the scale of the crisis. Secondly, there is clearly different treatment. But the third thing is the most important thing for me is the time. Time is the factor, because this is happening very quickly. And there's also an expectation that this will also somehow be resolved very quickly, that this will develop and somehow, but it will be resolved very quickly. And I don't think that anybody in Poland, although I really appreciate how they're receiving the refugees, but I wouldn't know if they'll be just as welcoming 2 years down the line or 3 years down the line. And so that is the factor which only time will tell. And based on, from my experience of living in Europe, my expectation is that I don't think that the attitudes are going to remain the same. And so that's why my hope for Ukraine is the same, that it will be resolved quickly. And I think that unlike in Syria, the one thing that the West did right in this case was gave Ukrainians the opportunity to fight back, that they were not left as completely exposed as the Syrians were. I mean, in Syria, a telling thing is that there was just one squadron of really old Mi-8 transport helicopters, which were dropping these improvised barrel bombs. And that is what decimated most of the cities. That's why most people fled, because they were not a battlefield weapon, they were a terror weapon. They would be only because they were unguided. You can't use them on a battlefield without the risk of hitting your own soldiers. So they would be used only over cities, and most cities were depopulated just by that kind of indiscriminate bombing. And those could have been, if Syrians had the same weapons that Ukrainians have been provided right now, the shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles, for example, those helicopters would have been just a one day's work. They would have disappeared from the sky in a day, and hundreds of thousands of lives could have been saved, and millions could have been prevented from becoming homeless. So I think that is the main thing that the West did right over here. I don't think that anybody wants to become a refugee. Anybody wants to become a refugee. It's rarely, if ever, a question of choice. So give them the opportunity not to become a refugee in the first place. And I think that should be the way to deal with questions of migration.
Sir, another thing I just want to add on, since again, we are circling back to the role of U.S. playing. During the speech that President Joe Biden shared at the NATO summit, and again, of course, the entire communication team, they have to walk back to what President Biden said before. But anyway, there was a misunderstanding, or the message was misinterpreted, was Joe Biden calling that the country of Russia to have this leader change, or what they called a regime change. And then later on the next day during the press conference, and the press secretary, she had to change, or she had to explain that in depth. Again, I may paraphrase it, but she was saying that we did not call Russia, or the president did not say Russia, to get rid of Vladimir Putin. And that just means that Vladimir Putin, he should give up the ambition, or give up this political goal to occupying Ukraine. Now, that's number one, sir. How do you think that we should understand such rhetoric? Because we know that U.S. for so long has been so reluctant in supporting Ukraine. And also, the Ukrainian leader Zelensky made petitions one after another, and then eventually U.S. step in. So how do you think that we should understand such rhetoric from the U.S. side? And the second thing is, how do you think that through the entire war between Russia and Ukraine, U.S. either U.S. government built the credibility to the world, or U.S. lost credibility tremendously, especially for the people in Ukraine? How do you think that we should understand that?
Well, I think that absolutely nobody in Ukraine would have expected that Biden is somehow going to wage a war to remove Putin. And that's not even on the cards. So when he made the statement, it would have been clear to everybody that this is an off-the-cuff statement. I mean, even the Russians would have known. It's a different thing that if you can then exploit it, because you can then say that, well, look, it's the president of the United States saying this, so clearly this must suggest, that's kind of the implication, that this must suggest a change in policy somehow, or a statement of some hidden policy. But we know that that's not the case. U.S. is actually very reluctant to get involved and try to do everything to initially avoid trying to get involved. And so because of that, there is, I don't think that there's any expectation that the policy has changed. It was a totally off-the-cuff statement, and what was clarified is the truth that the U.S. has no intention or capacity to bring about that kind of a change. But is there a wish that Vladimir Putin would be removed? Of course. I mean, I think that is, anybody in the West who's watching this, anybody not just in the West. There's a large population of even Russians, and certainly almost all of Ukraine, which would agree with that sentiment that yes, a leader like that should not remain in power. He's bringing disaster, obviously, to Ukraine. Ukraine is being destroyed totally indiscriminately. He has done that already to places like Syria. He did that to Chechnya. So should a person like that stay in power? Absolutely not. Everybody would agree with that. That, you know, anybody here with any sense of decency would say, they would say that that kind of person shouldn't be in power. But at the moment, he's also bringing disaster to the Russian people. You know, just the number of these, if you see these prisoners of war, many of them young people, many of the dead, most of them were the soldiers. They were born around the year 2001, 2002. So they have
right.
their entire lives have been spent under Putin's regime. So they have never known any other form of government. And these young people are being just used as cannon fodder. They're being killed in such numbers that, at one point, the Russian Ministry of Defense published and then quickly unpublished after suddenly it got a lot of attention, the numbers that they had. They admitted that the numbers were close to 10,000 that they had lost. This is about 10 days back.
Wow.
So the thing is that 10,000 soldiers, that is nearly 2/3 of what they lost. The Red Army lost over 10 years of war in Afghanistan, when they invaded Afghanistan in the past. And that's a lot more than the US and Britain have lost together in both the Iraq and Afghan war over a period of 20 years. So this is just in a month. So they are really bringing disaster to their own young people. And he's really undermining the country's economy. He's isolating the country. It can become more like North Korea if he continues in power. And then it's also going to become, we always, in the past, there was a lot of talk around the time of the Iraq war in the US about disaster capitalism. And there was a lot of truth to that when Iraq was invaded and the country suddenly, every institution and everything collapsed. So when it was being rebuilt, all kinds of vultures came in and they tried to seize every asset, any opportunity that they could. And it happened not just there, it happens when there's a tsunami, where there's something else, that, there's a lot of destruction. People come in and pick up the assets on the cheap. I mean, imagine what's going to happen, already is happening in Russia, that this economy is collapsing and it needs to somehow fund this war. So already there was news that the Indians have come in and secured some really sort of fire sale price kind of contracts for energy supplies. China is really viewing this as a great opportunity in the coming, because Russia after this is going to be in a really, economically vulnerable state.
Right.
So China's have this, whole opportunities for seizing assets and, asserting control over the country. So I think those are the kind of things that are the disaster that Putin is bringing to his own country. So as regards the sentiment, what Biden expressed, I think there are, millions of people